Welcome to Disposable Society, where we sift through the garbage of stereotypes and discrimination about people with disabilities and pick out the treasures of advocacy, inclusion, and innovation. My name is Caitlin, and for those with visual disabilities, I will describe my appearance today. I am wearing a long-sleeve shirt that's blue, and my hair is down. In the background, there's a mannequin and a sign that says open. And above that is a sign made out of disposable materials that says Disposable Society. Foucault once said that disabled people's lives have been blighted and demeaned by a degree of supervision that is probably without historical parallel. And this week, we are going to be talking about his concept, biopower. Biopower describes the strategic manipulation of bodies in order to transform them into more efficient, productive workers. It is centered on the body as a machine, its disciplining, the optimization of its capabilities, the extortion of its forces, the parallel increase of its usefulness and docility, its integration into systems of efficient and economic controls. Biopower is enforced on populations through those in power, like the government. In America's infancy, biopower was harnessed through immigration policy and the judicial system. Norms were born out of these laws and imposed upon people. The initial immigration policies targeted people with disabilities and people of color, for example, prohibiting those of inferior stock from entering the United States. Modernity saw a shift in the way that biopower was performed, though. With modernity came increased medicine and science. These areas of study gained public trust as expert fields, and they introduced tools like bell curves, BMI, vision tests, prenatal diagnostics. These tools were then adopted by the public themselves through modes of self-surveillance. Thus, the people in power were able to perform biopower and normalization practices in an indirect, covert manner because the public began doing it with and amongst themselves, prompted by these tools. Let's look at bell curves to illustrate one of these normalization tools. Bell curves show standard norms at the center of the graph toward the bell's curve. All of these normal wooden beads concentrated toward the center of the curve represent people who have the most common traits. If this were a bell curve focused on age that women give birth to their first child, the most concentrated point of the graph would represent the age 28 years old. All of the beads emanating from that most concentrated point represent ages that are less and less standard ages that women give birth to their first child. And the most outliers, called deviations, which I will represent using upcycled beads made from cardboard, represent women who give birth to their first child at the rarest of ages. These charts are created to represent all sorts of traits, and those that are most deviated from the norms are labeled deviants in society. Bell curves created some hurdles for those in power, though, because they saw that average height, for example, was not as tall as they desired in a superior population. So they created an algorithm to account for this and account for desirable traits, which very eugenicist and dystopian, if you ask me. We also see scientific tools like BMI and prenatal diagnostics adopted by the public as means of self-regulating norms. But we know that BMI charts are misleading and do not account for muscle mass. We also know that prenatal diagnostics tools to predict likelihood of genetic diseases rely more on risk factors than actual information. The concept of risk was adopted by the medical field from the insurance field and is really meant to mitigate genetic disabilities from entering the population and to encourage as much prenatal care as possible to boost the medical economy. In her essay, Waldschmidt outlines how 3 prenatal diagnostics tools are deceptive: family trees, age curves, and triple tests. The family tree is the most understood of the diagnostic tools and is used to trace the probability that a child will have a heritable disease or disability. A genetics counselor begins with a person who is pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant and traces their family network, pinpointing various genetic disabilities. If cystic fibrosis were present in the family tree, the geneticist would apply a probability and inform the mother that their child has a 5% chance of inheriting cystic fibrosis, for example. And this will certainly influence a prospective mother's decision to have a child or not. Waldschmidt argues these tests are used symbolically to elicit responsibility onto patients, expected to view her individual case in relation to the amassed statistics on correlations between genetic traits in mothers' ages and babies' disorders. The triple test seems to be almost purposefully confounding for clients. Its purpose to determine the risk of chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome. But the test results are given as either positive or negative, with positive results being just a 1% chance of chromosomal disorder. That's all these tests can do, yet some expecting mothers will choose to go through amniocentesis, a more invasive test that determines if the baby does indeed have the chromosomal disorder. But amniocentesis also has a 1% chance of miscarriage. So in our society, some prospective mothers perceive the risk of losing their baby as less significant than the risk that it has a disability. This is biopower. Medically, we don't just see testing as a tool of biopower, we also see categorization and classification. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, is an example that most of us are probably familiar with. When experts classify, label, and conceptualize, society goes through a structuralist process of making things knowable, wherein it becomes possible to see impairment and say disability. Because to the public, medical classification is, quote, truth. I can illustrate one example that shows the dangers of medical classification. In 2022, a research study was conducted that proposed that clinical characteristics existed that could support terminal anorexia as a diagnosis. An op-ed response to this proposed diagnosis pleaded against the creation of this concept, arguing that legitimizing terminal anorexia as a concept would only encourage the adoption of its deadly clinical characteristics in people, encouragement of a social trend with dire consequences. The op-ed author cited her own experience of adopting the clinical symptoms further, even discussing that her diagnosis made her eligible for assisted suicide. Assisted suicide was publicly promoted as a plausible solution after the creation of the term terminal anorexia, because those with it adopted the hopeless model that the term and symptoms insinuate. They adopted the notion that they were just disposable lost causes. Literature has been used to coax the public into adopting tools of biopower for much longer than medicine and science, though. Bedside Manners by Mary Dunn discusses the Jesuit Relations Manual. It was a manual used to promote the Jesuit faith and missionary projects as they colonized New France and Canada in the mid-1600s. The manual was produced annually for over 40 years, containing supposed narratives of ill and disabled indigenous peoples, blaming their ailments on their belief systems. It was religious propaganda to influence people to connect bodily health to belief in and practice of Christianity. Alternatively, it was used to correlate ill health and disability to traditional native belief systems. The manual was intended to reproduce the virtues of their beliefs and to make sense of the immoral horrors done upon colonized indigenous populations so they could live with themselves, frankly. It outlined how Jesuits were to try to convert indigenous, and it told of success stories and of painful resolutions of blasphemers. All of the tools I outlined were and are biopower tools used to strategically curate productive and normative bodies. I don't know about you, but my life isn't centered around being a productive worker every moment of every day. I adopt as few labels as possible. I eat healthy food. I exercise daily. I try to create for at least 30 minutes every day, even if it's just in the morning while I'm drinking coffee. I love being a productive member of society, but I also love going outside and reaping the benefits of this beautiful planet, soaking in the moment. I know that when I'm trying my best to live a balanced life is when I am the happiest. That is the only biopower test that I enact on myself. Thank you for spending some time with me. I will be posting a video on how to make some of the cardboard beads that you saw in this episode. And until next time, upcycle what you can.